How do you say hello in Dutch?
Hallo. What is the Dutch word for camping?
Kamperen.
What is the Dutch word for work?
Werk.
What does evening mean in Dutch?
Avond.
How do you say yes in Dutch?
Ja. What is the Dutch word for basketball?
Basketbal.
How do you say I'm lost in Dutch?
Ik ben verdwaald.
What is the Dutch word for meeting?
Vergadering.
What does dairy mean in English?
Dairy.
How do you say office in Dutch? Kantoor.
How do you say I miss you in Dutch? Ik mis je. How do you say meeting in Dutch? Vergadering.
How do you say to work in Dutch?
Werken.
How do you say I'm cold in Dutch?
Ik heb het koud.
What does tournament mean in English?
Tournament.
Translate athlete to Dutch.
Atleet.
Translate jump to Dutch.
Springen.
What is food in Dutch?
Eten.
Translate basketball to Dutch.
Basketbal.
What does pensioen mean in English?
Pension.
How do you say I love you in Dutch?
Ik hou van je. How do you say I'm cold in Dutch?
Ik heb het koud.
What is family in Dutch?
Familie.
How do you say taste in Dutch?
Smaak.
How do you say to drink in Dutch?
Drinken.
What is money in Dutch?
Geld.
How do you say I'm lost in Dutch?
Ik ben verdwaald.
How do you say I love you in Dutch?
Ik hou van je.
Translate training to Dutch.
Training.
How do you say vegetable in Dutch?
Groente.
Translate resort to Dutch. Vakantieoord.
Translate promotion to Dutch.
Promotie.
How do you say running in Dutch? Rennen.
What is the Dutch word for swimming?
Zwemmen.
Translate vegetarian to Dutch.
Vegetariër.
How do you say, I'm hot, in Dutch?
Ik heb het warm.
What is time in Dutch?
Tijd.
Translate tourist to Dutch.
Toerist. What is the Dutch word for exercise? Oefening.
What is tree in Dutch?
Boom.
What is the Dutch word for sweet?
Zoet.
Translate adventure to Dutch.
Avontuur.
Translate competition to Dutch.
Competitie.
How do you say, I'm surprised, in Dutch?
Ik ben verbaasd.
What is the Dutch word for bicycle?
Fiets. What is the Dutch word for food? Voedsel.
Translate colleague to Dutch.
Collega.
Translate spicy to Dutch.
Pittig.
What is the Dutch word for score?
Scoren.
Translate tiger to Dutch.
Tijger. What is the Dutch word for colleague? Collega.
What is the Dutch word for winner?
Winnaar.
What is the Dutch word for sun?
Zon.
How do you say, I'm in love, in Dutch?
Ik ben verliefd.
What is book in Dutch?
Boek.
Translate meal to Dutch.
Maaltijd.
Translate ocean into Dutch.
Oceaan.
How do you say running in Dutch?
Rennen. How do you say, I'm angry, in Dutch? Ik ben boos.
What does to run mean in Dutch?
Rennen.
How do you say thank you in Dutch?
Dankjewel.
What does to sleep mean in Dutch?
Slapen.
What is tree in Dutch?
Boom.
How do you say tourist in Dutch?
Vakantieganger.
What does office mean in English?
Office.
What is the Dutch word for victory?
Overwinning.
What is time in Dutch?
Tijd.
What is the Dutch word for athletics?
Atletiek. What is the Dutch word for job? Baan.
What is friend in Dutch?
Vriend.
How do you say to drink in Dutch?
Drinken.
Translate task to Dutch.
Taak.
What does to read mean in Dutch?
Lezen. What does colleague mean in English? Colleague. How do you say stadium in Dutch? Stadion.
How do you say goalkeeper in Dutch?
Doelman.
How do you say, I'm sad, in Dutch?
Ik ben verdrietig.
What is the Dutch word for gymnastics?
Turnen.
What is the Dutch word for job?
Baan.
How do you say, I'm sick, in Dutch?
Ik ben ziek.
Translate destination to Dutch.
Bestemming.
What is the Dutch word for interview?
Interview.
What does interview mean in English?
Interview.
How do you say spectator in Dutch?
Toeschouwer.
How do you say athlete in Dutch?
Atleet.
What is the Dutch word for race?
Race.
How do you say coach in Dutch?
Trainer.
What is the Dutch word for travel?
Reis.
What is water in Dutch?
Water.
What is the Dutch word for snake?
Slang.
What is the Dutch word for hockey?
Hockey.
How do you say, I'm angry, in Dutch?
Ik ben boos. What does to swim mean in Dutch? Zwemmen.
How do you say, I'm in love, in Dutch?
Ik ben verliefd.
What is the Dutch word for athletics?
Atletiek.
Translate business to Dutch.
Zakelijk.
Translate to travel into Dutch.
Reizen.
How do you say spectator in Dutch?
Toeschouwer.
What does salaries mean in English?
Celery.
What does excursion mean in English?
Excursion.
What is the Dutch word for bicycle?
Fiets.
How do you say plate in Dutch?
Boord.
Translate beach to Dutch.
Strand.
What is the Dutch word for victory?
Overwinning.
Translate training to Dutch.
Training.
Translate contract to Dutch.
Contract.
Translate swimming to Dutch.
Zwemmen.
Translate coach to Dutch.
Trainer.
Translate chocolate to Dutch.
Chocolade.
What does dinner mean in Dutch?
Diner.
How do you say phone in Dutch?
Telefoon.
Translate basketball to Dutch.
Basketbal.
What does to buy mean in Dutch?
Kopen.
Translate football to Dutch.
Voetbal.
Translate penguin to Dutch.
Pinguïn.
How do you say beach in Dutch?
Strand. What does water mean in Dutch? Water. What does to run mean in Dutch? Rennen.
Translate competition to Dutch.
Competitie.
What does goal mean in English?
Goal.
How do you say customer in Dutch?
Klant.
What is the Dutch word for referee?
Scheidsrechter.
How do you say vacation in Dutch?
Vakantie.
What is the Dutch word for breakfast?
Ontbijt.
What does to listen mean in Dutch?
Luisteren.
How do you say please wait in Dutch?
Wacht alstublieft.
What is the Dutch word for cruise?
Cruise. What does interview mean in English? Interview. What is the Dutch word for presentation? Presentatie.
How do you say fork in Dutch?
Vork.
What does to work mean in Dutch?
Werken.
What is family in Dutch?
Familie.
How do you say schedule in Dutch?
Schema.
How do you say W in Dutch?
Winnen.
Translate deadline to Dutch.
Deadline.
How do you say meeting in Dutch?
Vergadering.
How do you say I miss you in Dutch?
Ik mis je.
What does goal mean in English?
Goal.
Translate soccer to Dutch.
Voetbal. How do you say, I'm happy, in Dutch? Ik ben blij.
What does salaries mean in English?
Salary.
How do you say promotion in Dutch?
Promotie.
What does to read mean in Dutch?
Lezen.
How do you say delicious in Dutch?
Lekker.
What is door in Dutch?
Deur.
What is the Dutch word for sport?
Sport.
How do you say I'm lost in Dutch?
Ik ben verdwaald.
How do you say I'm sick in Dutch?
Ik ben ziek.
How do you say I'm thirsty in Dutch?
Ik heb dorst.
Translate golf to Dutch.
Golf.
Translate ball to Dutch.
Bal.
How do you say help me in Dutch?
Help me.
How do you say spoon in Dutch?
Lepel.
How do you say team in Dutch?
Team. How do you say, I'm excited, in Dutch? Ik ben enthousiast.
What does to understand mean in Dutch?
Begrijpen.
What is time in Dutch?
Tijd.
How do you say I'm sad in Dutch?
Ik ben verdrietig.
How do you say I'm excited in Dutch?
Ik ben enthousiast.
Translate house into Dutch.
Huis.
Translate ball to Dutch.
Bal. How do you say, running, in Dutch? Rennen. How do you say, ticket, in Dutch? Kaartje.
Translate dinner to Dutch.
Diner.
What is the Dutch word for dessert?
Nagerecht.
What is the Dutch word for chef?
Kok.
How do you say jogging in Dutch?
Hardlopen.
How do you say I'm thirsty in Dutch?
Ik heb dorst.
What is friend in Dutch?
Vriend.
Translate customer to Dutch.
Klant.
How do you say athlete in Dutch?
Atleet.
Translate breakfast to Dutch.
Ontbijt.
What does to understand mean in Dutch?
Begrijpen.
How do you say phone in Dutch?
Telefoon.
How do you say bear in Dutch?
Beer.
Translate tennis to Dutch.
Tennis.
What is the Dutch word for volleyball?
Volleybal.
How do you say I'm in a hurry in Dutch?
Ik heb haast.
What is bathroom in Dutch?
Badkamer.
What is the Dutch word for employment?
Dienstverband.
What is city in Dutch?
Stad.
How do you say I'm in a hurry in Dutch?
Ik heb haast.
What is door in Dutch?
Deur.
How do you say deer in Dutch?
Hert.
What is the Dutch word for office?
Kantoor.
What is the Dutch word for salary?
Salaris.
Translate thank you into Dutch.
Dankjewel.
What is the Dutch word for swimming?
Zwemmen.
What is to drink in Dutch?
Drinken.
Translate schedule to Dutch.
Schema.
Translate snack to Dutch.
Tussendoortje.
How do you say invoice in Dutch?
Factuur.
Translate athlete to Dutch.
Atleet.
Translate house into Dutch.
Huis.
What does hotel mean in English?
Hotel.
How do you say team in Dutch?
Team.
Translate contract to Dutch.
Contract.
What does to buy mean in Dutch?
Kopen.
What does insect mean in English?
Insect.
How do you say team in Dutch?
10.
How do you say, help me, in Dutch?
Help me.
How do you say, medal, in Dutch?
Medaille.
Translate, to travel, into Dutch.
Reizen.
How do you say, I'm bored, in Dutch?
Ik verveel me.
Translate jump to Dutch.
Springen.
What is shoes in Dutch?
Schoenen.
Translate, to travel, into Dutch.
Reizen.
How do you say, race, in Dutch?
Race.
What is the Dutch word for panda?
Panda.
What does, I'm sorry, mean in Dutch?
Het spijt me.
How do you say, running, in Dutch?
Rennen.
How do you say, w'en, in Dutch?
Winnen.
How do you say, bottle, in Dutch?
Fles.
How do you say, excuse me, in Dutch?
Excuseer me.
How do you say, I'm hot, in Dutch?
Ik heb het warm.
How do you say, I'm bored, in Dutch?
Ik verveel me.
Translate, w'en to Dutch.
Winnen.
What does to run mean in Dutch?
Rennen.
What is city in Dutch?
Stad.
How do you say, goalkeeper, in Dutch?
Doelman.
Translate break to Dutch.
Pauze.
How do you say, flight, in Dutch?
Vlucht.
What is city in Dutch?
Stad.
What is, to write, in Dutch?
Schrijven.
How do you say, medal, in Dutch?
Medaille.
What is the Dutch word for office?
Kantoor.
How do you say, promotion, in Dutch?
Promotie.
How do you say, deadline, in Dutch?
Tijdslimiet.
How do you say, I'm in love, in Dutch?
Ik ben verliefd.
What is the Dutch word for shark?
Haai.
Translate email to Dutch.
E-mail.
What does to read mean in Dutch?
Lezen.
How do you say, I'm sad, in Dutch?
Ik ben verdrietig.
What is the Dutch word for exercise?
Oefening.
Translate project to Dutch.
Project.
How do you say, I'm tired, in Dutch?
Ik ben moe.
Translate, thank you, into Dutch.
Dankjewel.
What does to sleep mean in Dutch?
Slapen.
How do you say race in Dutch?
Race.
Translate cycling to Dutch.
Fietsen.
How do you say I'm sick in Dutch?
Ik ben ziek.
What is the Dutch word for lose?
Verliezen.
What is the Dutch word for bread?
Brood.
What is food in Dutch?
Eten.
What is car in Dutch?
Auto.
How do you say rabbit, in Dutch?
Konijn.
How do you say customer in Dutch?
Klant.
How do you say, I need help, in Dutch?
Ik heb hulp nodig.
What is the Dutch word for chicken?
Kip.
Translate butterfly to Dutch.
Vlinder.
Translate athlete to Dutch.
Atleet.
How do you say I'm ready in Dutch?
Ik ben klaar.
How do you say I'm cold in Dutch?
Ik heb het koud.
What is door in Dutch?
Deur.
What does to listen mean in Dutch?
Luisteren.
What is family in Dutch?
Familie.
What is the Dutch word for passport?
Paspoort.
How do you say dinner in Dutch?
Avondeten.
What is tree in Dutch?
Boom.
Translate coach to Dutch.
Trainer.
How do you say I'm in a hurry in Dutch?
Ik heb haast.
What is the Dutch word for project?
Project.
How do you say coffee in Dutch?
Koffie.
How do you say champion in Dutch?
Kampioen.
What does fruit mean in English?
Fruit.
What is the Dutch word for hockey?
Hockey.
Translate schedule to Dutch.
Tijdschema.
How do you say, I'm angry, in Dutch?
Ik ben boos.
How do you say running in Dutch?
Rennen.
What does recipe mean in English?
Recipe.
What is the Dutch word for drink?
Drank.
How do you say to work in Dutch?
Werken.
What is to write, in Dutch?
Schrijven.
How do you say computer in Dutch?
Computer.
What is the Dutch word for coach?
Trainer.
What does goal mean in English?
Goal.
What is the Dutch word for deadline?
Tijdslimiet.
How do you say manager in Dutch?
Manager.
What is the Dutch word for race?
Race.
What is moon, in Dutch?
Maan.
How do you say please in Dutch?
Alstublieft.
What does to buy mean in Dutch?
Kopen.
What does breakfast mean in Dutch?
Ontbijt.
What is the Dutch word for coach?
Trainer.
Translate spice to Dutch.
Kruid.
How do you say presentation in Dutch?
Presentatie.
How do you say I'm excited in Dutch?
Ik ben enthousiast.
What does contract mean in English?
Contract.
How do you say athlete in Dutch?
Atleet.
What is book in Dutch?
Boek.
What does water mean in Dutch?
Water.